that. Right. We feel free to use the chat box. You're already doing that as we go. If you haven't yet told us who you are, where you're from, please do so. It's great to see so many friendly faces and names coming in. Right, let's crack on. So today's theme. Clearly, we're living in a deeply disturbing and disruptive moment for the world. In addition to the pandemic itself, many systemic challenges that pre-existed the virus have been brought into stark relief. So it turns out the governments around the world are indeed here to help, and we're learning new things about ourselves and what's possible. So we set this conversation series up to really kind of explore what we should be thinking and doing in this time of upheaval, and possibly how we can take our learning from this moment in time into what comes next. And so to discuss this, we've got 3 States of Change Fellows, former Nesta CEO, my old boss, and now professor at UCL, Geoff Mulgan, Gabriella Gomez Mont, former head of the Laboratorio de la Ciudad in Mexico City, and Marco Steinberg, now at Snowcone Haystack, former head of the Helsinki Design Lab. And I should also big shout out to Jesper Christensen, also the fellow co-founder of States of Change, who's also on the call. You may have been invited from him to join the call. He is also lurking and may poke his head up at some point and say hello. So the way this is going to work, Jeff's going to give us a little bit of a brief introduction provocation. I'm going to ask Gabriella and Marco to come back with some thoughts, observations, and responses to what they've heard. We'll then open that up to the dialogue, and then we'll see how crazy this gets with Q&A. So please feel free to throw comments into the chat function, and we will try and get this, make this a useful conversation and get this all wrapped up bang on time at 11 a.m. London time to make sure you get onto your next conference call. So with that, Geoff, where are we?
So, well, good morning, evening, wherever you are around the world, and thanks, Brenton and Jesper, for setting this up. You'll see my kitchen in the background, probably. Like everyone, I seem to live between the kitchen and a computer. Actually, I'm not sure what is showing on anyone's screen. I think we're still probably seeing you, Brenton.
I'm seeing you. So
oh, you're seeing...
Okay. I think if you're talking, they'll see you.
Fine. And one of the weird things about this whole bizarre period is, in some ways, it's been, although everyone's in isolation, it's been incredibly social in some ways with gatherings like this. There's an amazing group on this call, so I'm not going to talk too long, because I really want to hear what lots of you have to say about what's going on. What I thought I'd do is talk very briefly on 4 categories from the conversation. And 2 of these categories I've written blogs on, so I'm not going to go into detail on those. I think we're all seeing this extraordinary, extreme stress test underway of, you know, what governments can do, their relationship with citizens, and it will be a long time before we really know who's performed well. We've got completely different approaches in Sweden, Israel, Korea, Germany, let alone parts of Africa, South America, and as I say, we're seeing this extraordinary rapid experiment in so many dimensions in real time, and an acceleration of innovation of all kinds. So 4 categories to get us going. So category 1 is the sort of innovations in crisis responses. And here, so far, the East Asian countries, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, seem to have done much better at using data, using tracking tools, so that everyday life is continuing to a large degree, certainly in Singapore. And then things like organizing food, organizing visits, organizing volunteers, the planning to get ventilators manufactured. So literally about a mile from where I'm sitting here in Luton, we have a factory which has been converted to ventilator manufacture. Some of my colleagues in UCL have created a new ventilator in extraordinary speed. And lots of, in some ways, classic government logistic work to get protective equipment and clothing to doctors and nurses quickly. And some, I think, are doing it amazingly. Some are really struggling. And one of the more interesting and controversial bits of this, which was on our news this morning, was the West essentially trying to copy from East Asia tracking apps. And now, how do you persuade half the population to put an app on their phone which tracks you so that if you are tested positive, it automatically contacts all the people you've been in contact with in the last 2 weeks? That is culturally challenging, and raising all sorts of issues of state capacity and legitimacy. The second sort of big theme I wanted to mention is one which any of you who know me know I've been obsessed with for quite a while, which is really how government orchestrates intelligence of all kinds. Data, citizen intelligence, knowledge, and so on. And I've been advocating for quite a while that the real challenge for government is to do what we do in our own brains, on a good day at least, which is linking up our observation, our analysis, our prediction, our creativity, and our judgment into a single system. And some places have really got this idea, but I'd say most haven't at all. COVID-19, his force is making it much more obvious why you have to do that. That is essentially what every government is having to do in real time, is create an intelligence assembly, which brings in data from multiple sources to understand who's being infected, where they're being affected, who they've had contact with, etc., etc. And then the orchestration of evidence on what is working, the management of lots of mini experiments and trials on 101 dimensions. And my hope is that when we come out of this crisis, it will also be obvious that these are methods which can be applied to lots of other things. And the most important one for me is climate change, where I've been working quite a bit in the last few months of what would an intelligence assembly look like around net zero for Europe in particular. How would you be properly tracking every aspect of carbon emissions, organizing the evidence on what works and everything from retrofitting to new transport methods to food waste, and turning it all into an intelligent system to help us radically change our economy and society. But as far as I'm aware, nowhere in the world is doing that yet. And COVID-19, though, is accelerating, I hope, thought about these kind of assemblies. And of course, alongside it, and this has been a very live debate in many countries in the last week or two, the more you are actually linking up that kind of data, much of which is very sensitive, the more you need new governance arrangements to guarantee that data isn't being misused and abused. So there's a parallel, I think, revival of the discussions which have been had about data trusts, new forms of governance of sensitive data, which again haven't really been implemented anywhere in the world yet, but I think we can see more clearly than ever before a next generation of government where there is dramatically more collective intelligence and data linking, but also far stronger governance, regulation, and protection against abuse of that data. The next category then, which I did the blog on, the first blog, was about looking at what other areas of policy might we be seeing new options coming into light because of COVID-19. And there are many of these, as well as the ones I've just mentioned. So isolation is a good example. 15 years ago, no government talked about loneliness and isolation as issues of public policy. More recently, it's begun to be talked about, and the UK even had a minister for loneliness at one point. But given we have a whole population in isolation and acute challenges of the frail elderly and how to organize circles of support around them and so on, lots of things which I think were a bit off the agenda are forced to become necessities because of the current crisis. And again, in the blog, I give some of the examples of attempts over the years to create support structures which link the formal parts of the state, doctors, social workers, nurses, to the informal support of family, friends, and neighbours. None of these have quite worked in the past for all sorts of reasons, but I think this crisis will take them to the next stage, and they will just become part of daily life, of how we keep an eye out for the neighbour 2 doors down who's 87 with multiple conditions, their family live perhaps the other side of the country. We're seeing incredible speed of innovation around welfare, providing financial support, and many places where that isn't happening, real problems in countries like Italy, and all sorts of reactions if people aren't getting that basic welfare support. India, I think, is an even more extreme example. But in some countries, at least, the state has moved really quickly with things which look not a million miles from universal basic income and other kind of emergency support systems. And again, I think this is shining a light on those countries which have put in place more standardized, simpler, streamlined ways of providing financial support or loans to citizens, and those which have really a sort of patchwork of legacy systems which often don't work, and they've really struggled. The UK is in that latter case. And I would predict that every government needs some of these very simple standardized systems on identification, personal accounts, and so on, for all sorts of reasons in future welfare, and this crisis is bringing that into much, much sharper relief. And the same, of course, is true of support for business, and not just loan support, but cash support, and so on. And then the final thing I thought I'd put on the table, and again, I've written a piece for States of Change on this, is how we'll think about handling of risk after the crisis. And here I was going to share a little bit of history. So about 20 years ago, when I was working in the UK government, we had a series of problem crises. One was a fuel tanker drivers strike, where it became clear that in a just-in-time economy, the whole society economy could grind to a halt really, really quickly with just a few people blocking fuel depots. Our hospitals would stop, food supplies would stop. And it was kind of scary, and it turned out government didn't really have any way of handling it. And then a few months later, we had a foot and mouth disease, which completely brought the countryside to a halt. And in the end, millions of cattle and sheep had to be slaughtered to put that under control. So we were given the job of looking in a sort of comprehensive way at how government should think about risks. And we did it was a very kind of bureaucratic exercise in a way. We looked at big companies, we looked at other governments, we looked at UN agencies. How did they do it well or badly? And so in the blog, I described this in more detail. Some of it was kind of obvious, that if you want to handle risk well, you've got to think about it, you've got to talk about it, you've got to almost require every bit of your system every now and again to scan the horizon for what horrible shocks might come and hit you, to make sure you're doing the preparatory work, thinking through what your responses will be and your strategies, and also getting the top decision makers, and this was a crucial thing, to go through gaming or simulations where they'd get a real feel for what a crisis would be like in real time, with the media pressures, the ambiguities of information that there are. And we were particularly impressed then by countries like Singapore, which regularly did take top leaders through simulations of things like water supplies being cut off or financial crises. Now, what's kind of striking in retrospect is that for most of the time since then, in the UK's sort of risk register, pandemics have been the #1 risk, seen about on a par with nuclear and biological warfare attacks, but seen as much more likely. There was very detailed work on, there was even a pandemics preparation unit. The hospitals went through exercises, preparing for surges of numbers, thinking through the triage dilemmas when there weren't enough ventilators or intensive care units for the numbers. In some ways, it was all done fairly well. The sad thing for this country is that in the last few years, most of that then atrophied. Austerity meant many of those teams were shut down, including the pandemics preparation unit, slightly unfortunately. And I think, though I haven't proved this, that none of the current decision makers had been through the kind of intensive simulation exercise which we discovered was so important. And one sign that they hadn't done that was that in this country, at least for a time, very brief period, they tried to implement a herd immunity mitigation strategy, which is being done in some other countries like Sweden. And within 24 hours, it had unraveled under pressure from public opinion, the media, and politics. And any simulation exercise would very quickly have shown that that was not a viable strategy, that a government, a British, certainly Prime Minister, couldn't say they were willing to accept hundreds of thousands of deaths as the price for getting what's called herd immunity in place. So I'm pretty sure that hadn't happened here. So anyway, there's a series of sort of methods for dealing with risk, which in some ways are the mirror of what all of most people on this call do around innovation. So innovation is essentially the positive view of risk. How do you encourage good risk taking, trying out new things, experimenting, being curious, being creative? But for government to be effective and legitimate, it has to put as much effort into being attuned to negative risks, being a bit paranoid, and building into every aspect of its systems regular scanning for threats and preparation and simulations and scenarios and gaming. And my guess is after this crisis, there will be another sort of surge of demand within governments for better risk management, because quite a lot of them have looked very unsteady and very unprepared for this crisis, which should have been the most predictable crisis of them all. As I say, in this country, pandemics were top of the list. There have been Hollywood movies on, viruses jumping from animals in South China and infecting the world. Every futurologist, for as long as I can remember, has had this kind of pandemic, indeed worse ones usually, very integral to their stories. So there's not much excuse for anyone to be surprised by this, but because of austerity, because of all the distractions, perhaps because of a bit of the tone of politics in many countries, I think many governments just took their eye off the ball. Yet in the long run, it's the ability of a government to protect its citizens from risks they cannot handle on their own is absolutely core to what makes it legitimate. So I hope that's enough to get us started at least, and maybe to provoke someone.
Thanks, Geoff. Lots of thoughts there, but I'm going to hold my questions and observations for a little bit longer. Gabriella, would you like to jump in?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see some friendly faces out there. I am in Amsterdam right now, a direct flight from Mexico City. Need be that I have to go home at any moment. And basically the reflections that I've had now, as well as 2 years ago, actually, because as you probably know, we had a big earthquake in Mexico City. Not as big as 85, that there was more than 10,000 people that died, but anyway, there was more than 400 people dead. And that actually really was very painful, but very necessary, I think, space of reflection of what happens during a crisis. That funnily enough, even from the origins, the word crises, I think is very telling for these times at hand, because it's a turning point in a disease that change which indicates recovery or death. And I have the feeling that that is where we are right now, like at the midst of the threshold. And I think in a threshold, we already know that the reality as was no longer exists and has slipped from our hands. But at the same time, it's very hard to fathom what comes next. So how do you actually plan proactively for this unknown? I think becomes one of the big questions, and rather we get stuck in an immediacy that I think starts loosening up in a certain time and space. But still right now, I have the feeling that that is very much where we are. So both because of the reflections of what is happening now, but also, again, like having lived through a crisis and also knowing the history of crises in Mexico City, I think one of the things that I take, which is incredibly positive, I think, is not only the new ideas coming out, but also a recovery and a reconsideration of things that I think that in public innovation space, we have been talking about quite a bit, preaching to the choir, many times to deaf ears on a larger scale. One of them, I think, is a very swift reconsideration of all things public. What does that actually mean? A very necessary conversation around the civic space, where it would seem to be that for this new governance model that Geoff succinctly talked about, that I also believe should be very much in the making towards the future, that we actually need to, as governments, not only do our vertical ties, like government to the people, but actually how can governments also, as these orchestrators of citizen talent, but also of resources, of the commons, if you will, how do we also start creating those horizontal ties which become more one-on-one, which can definitely help to get us out of a crisis. And one of the things that we saw in Mexico City, which was, again, like both incredibly interesting and also painful, is that because of the huge mistrust between government and civil society, these two things were running on parallel tracks. So there is a series of redundancies and a series of places where actually both of these processes clash that can actually even put lives at peril. And at the same time, I do think that especially as first responders, the swift capacity of civil society while government is still trying to figure out what's happening on the ground becomes a lifesaver in many cases. So how do we start creating, and for a crisis, but also post-crisis, a much more nuanced participatory scaffolding that is no longer as naive, I think, as we all came into the space of thinking, okay, just like let the citizen voices in, let the citizen talent in, and everything will be solved on its own. And it's like, no, it has to be a much more nuanced conversation. It has to be in terms of everything from the social structuring to the technological infrastructure. This has to become, I believe, every time more sophisticated. I also think that many of the things that we more or less took for granted in this space have become upended. I've been thinking a lot about efficiency, for example. Don't get me wrong, efficiency is necessary, but we're now seeing, especially when we're dealing with systemic thought and a systemic crises, that redundancies become just as important as the efficiencies. So what does that actually look like? And how can we join a conversation between urban commons, idling capacity, as talent capacity, on all of these things that could lead a double life, if you will? Everything from, as we've been seeing, things being refurbished for, and this is actually some of the research that we did post-earthquake in Mexico City. Can public space still keep to public space, but then also become another thing? And I'll say a very quick example, because these are, I know, the tiny interventions, and pass the word to Marco, but one of the most interesting things that we saw in Mexico City in the earthquake was that even though bike lanes, as many other places in the world, were very suspect and not necessarily very well received, especially by the small businesses along the streets or by the car owners either. During the crisis, there were so many people, tragic and beautiful, driving towards disaster to try to help, that it created a complete gridlock. And the way that we actually got the supplies and the medicines and the help to the disaster zones was through the bike lanes, and with the bike community that is actually incredibly well organized, because they've been activists since 10 years ago. So I'd leave perhaps with that consideration, like how do we think about redundancies where we don't have the space to leave an idling capacity, but so how do we join the conversation of the commons, of this double life that everything from networks to spaces to talents could actually use to be able to put into play during a crisis, but that has to be thought into the system.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gabriella. You crammed an awful lot there into that very brief intervention, but we can unpack a few of those in a moment. Marco, would you like to add to the mix?
Sure. Thanks, Brenton, and thanks to Geoff and Gabriella for some very good remarks. And I'll just start out by saying that I'm very sympathetic for the framing that was provided and for Geoff's thoughts and Gabriella's follow-up. And I think in terms of, in the tradition of stimulating a conversation, I'll take a bit of a contrarian position, not because I believe in these ideas necessarily, but these are the little things that are gnawing at me and haunt me a little bit. So I do think we are at this kind of moment where there's potentially, we're at a kind of pivot. Will this crisis sort of push us forward, where actually we will rethink what social contract is, rights to privacy, benefits in society, how do we govern, how do we mobilize things? Will this be it? And can we then get to the questions that I think Geoff rightly puts on the table? Will this help us address questions of carbon, environment, et cetera, et cetera? Or counterintuitively, will this actually push us back and lock us further entrenched in the current logics? And so I think we should also look at that part of the equation. And so a couple of things I just would like to put on the table that bother me. I think the question of fatigue. I mean, all the way from the fatigue of individuals, you look at first responders, I don't know how they deal with it. And I certainly don't know how they're going to recover after things let loose, not let loose, but recover. So I think there's fatigue, but there's fatigue in the system. We also see, and I'll speak just in Finland, but I think this can be seen in other environments. We have some emergency laws that we've been applying. We've been applying laws that have never been applied post-World War II. And even during World War II, some of these measures have not been applied. So in some cases, we're doing things like the Helsinki region is now in lockdown. We can't travel outside of it, something that's never happened in Finnish history. And there are people who are, legal scholars, but also populists, sort of two ends of the spectrum, you could say, that are pushing back And they're saying, you know, are some of these emergency laws actually justifiable? And will this set a precedent? Will make it more easy in the future to apply some of these laws? So I wonder how much we will kind of push back on some of these things. What are the entrenched interests in the current system? And actually, if we do find success, which I think we all hope, will this actually be used to validate that although there were logistical and technical problems, the fundamentals were somewhat sound because we were able to survive? So I'm a bit fearful of this kind of, are we going to push forward or are we going to lock ourselves back in? And I think we need to look at that. I think the other thing here is there, I see sort of almost like when you're flying, there's sort of different layers in the air, and you might get turbulence from them because they have different speeds or temperatures in them. So one is a conversation around governance, about social contract, about almost the fundamentals of how we build our societies. And then there's another conversation that's much more technical and logistical. It's about masks and ventilators and you know, assembling know-how, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm fearful that the rush for ventilators and masks will create noise on the more fundamentals questions. I mean, fundamentals sort of moving forward. So how do we sort of sift through some of those kinds of issues? I wanted to just maybe end with sort of two buckets. One is a legal conversation. Yesterday we had a bit of a conversation, and Chelsea Mulgan, I thought, brought up a very good point, and we're talking about the kind of legal innovation that's happening right now and will have to happen. As many of us know already, there is a class action suit against the Tyrol region in Austria because in one of the ski resorts, thousands of people spread the virus in Europe. And so what is commercial, but also sort of public liability in a global context? And you could spin this out if you want to become very populist and Trumpian. You could say Trump is going to sue China because this was the Chinese virus. I don't mean that, but you can begin to see that there will be a kind of, you know, we'll have to come to some sort of sense of who's responsible for the impacts beyond national and political borders of actions taken or not taken. The other side, at this point. Yeah, and the other side of this, which I think is kind of interesting, I've been quite privileged in that I've been helping UNDP work on a project in Uruguay. Uruguay is building a pulp manufacturing plant. It happens to be a Finnish one. It's the biggest foreign investment of any Finnish company in the world. It's the biggest direct foreign investment in Uruguay's history. It's the biggest plant in the world. The way that it's been, the contract that was signed between the company and the country is quite contentious. Uruguay is putting up quite a bit of money to make this happen, but it's happened. Now, the grassroots opponents of this initiative have used Article 7 in the contract, which is basically a force majeure clause that actually states, amongst other things, epidemics as a reason to undo the contract. And they found their way in. And so it's kind of interesting to see how the epidemic is being used to begin to reframe the our legal arguments in there. So I think there's a legal bucket. And so, sorry, I'll just end very quickly on maybe three things that I think we as a community can begin to at least work on, and many, many more, undoubtedly. Maps. If any, you know, most of you know ghost maps, the history of sort of cholera in London. I don't think that our leverage of maps, and so we're talking about information in a certain way, has evolved much since then. And yet our capacity has evolved tremendously. And we're talking a little bit about meshing ethnography and other kinds of means to really get a much more precise understanding of what's happening. Because there's a lot of collateral damage that's happening in these measures: economic impact on people, depression, isolation. And again, on this, are we going to push forward or being locked backwards? I think there's a conversation to be had. How will this populist conversation that was happening before the epidemic play itself afterwards? And I think there will be a lash against the elites, that a lot of these measures have benefited the elites and actually have hurt. And I think this is one of the sort of big dangers. So can we find a much more targeted way of creating interventions and designing those interventions that don't create a lot of these mass scale liabilities. I think this risk question is really important, and I think Geoff brings a very important point up. And I think we need to begin to have a conversation of risk, not, innovation not as taking on risks, but actually mitigating risk. And I think we need to be very good at lobbying at this. And then service delivery. I mean, I think we're going to see a very different way of delivering public services. Who's going to do that work? And can we ramp it up to scale? Otherwise, the old logic will just prevail. Thanks.
Thanks, Marco. Look, so we're going to open it up now a little bit amongst the three of us, and then I'm going to start feeding in some of the questions from the group chat. Maybe I might throw it back to Geoff if there's anything there that you wanted to respond to that you've heard from Gabriella and Marco. If not, or throw into the mix. Obviously, States of Change being a sort of learning collective, you know, one of the things that we are sort of spending our time thinking about are what is it that public servants are going to need to learn to do going forward, skills, culture, and so on, to sort of manage through the crisis and beyond. And conversely, what do we need to unlearn? What are some of the things, and this is to Gabriella and Marco as well. I think we've seen a lot of shibboleths and sort of myths about what can and can't be done by government being sort of absolutely destroyed, about how quickly public services can mobilize, what sorts of things can be done in what timeframes. But what are going to be the sort of the skills and what do we need to learn to sort of sustain that, I guess. So Geoff, that's a sort of opening question, but equally feel free if there's something that you heard from Gabriella and Marco you wanted to respond to or do it on.
Well, just very, very quickly. So I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think there's definitely plenty of scope for very negative results out of this. We're already seeing Hungary using this to tighten up authoritarian rules of all kinds. The populist play will be to blame China. We're already seeing this as a conscious move of the right to start finding people to blame for their own failures, and the US as well. And the money sucked out of the system will also mean far less scope for doing lots of good things. In a way, what the good side of this, though, has been, as with any war, is people just doing stuff, not being held back by too many bureaucratic rules or regulations and so on. It's vital, though, that there is then a second wave, which takes stock of whether these, the crisis responses are ones you want to keep, because most of them you probably don't want to keep, and there's a big risk of many of them becoming the new normal. And then just finally, on the chat, there's some really useful sharing of other places which are gathering together, the examples of responses on business, welfare, et cetera, So I think one thing, if nothing else, States of Change should be doing is just sharing the best sources of global knowledge, because one weird thing this crisis is showing is the weakness of the global institutions at orchestrating global responses. Cooperation has virtually ground to a halt. So actually it's the networks like this need to fill a bit of that space.
Brilliant. Anything else you want to add, Gabriella, Marco?
Well, very briefly, two things come to mind. Is one of them, how could we gather the lessons while they're hot? Because I have the feeling that two things happen when we're full of lessons, both on a personal as well as collective level, which is when the crisis seems to come down, so does the urgency.
Yeah.
And I have the feeling that very distraught, possibly very nervous civil servants the world over are learning incredibly quickly, and there's not necessarily right now the capacity to reflect back. Many of the best protocols that have come out of the world have come post-crises, but they're mostly institutional responses where the bureaucracy already knows how to work them out. For example, after the '85 earthquake in Mexico City, as you see, earthquakes are a defining point in Mexican life, for better or for worse, came the protocols of making all general hospitals sustainable for 72 hours that became worldwide protocol. Yeah. But one of the things that is very hard to do is how do you actually have a governance protocol come out of these things? And so even though I'm sure that there's a lot of lessons, how do you actually start, as I mentioned, creating this scaffolding that more or less shows the way so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time something like this comes about, especially in societies that are not autocratic, if you will, and hence, the social component will definitely have to play a huge role. And last but not least, and this is more of a long-term conversation, both in terms of the things that have surfaced of, yes, governments are important, strong institutions are important, experts are important, the public realm is important. How do we create a more nuanced conversation going forward about the civic space? Because I think another of the changes in the last times has been thinking that government's role is this many times technocratic institution of, delivering services, that's about it. And notwithstanding that I love, behavioral psychology and nudges, like I have the feeling that's the start of a conversation, but you can only have that surface conversation with your constituency for so long. We actually need to deal with urban pedagogy and social pedagogy, and so people know how to make every time better choices when we're really thinking about more distributed, more horizontal systems. So what does that look like, and what is government's role in it without becoming stuck in ideological entrenched views, I think is going to become a necessary question.
Great. Marco, if you're going to come in, I just wanted to mention, hopefully James or Jesper might be able to drop the link into the chat. There was a really interesting blog post that we shared around on our Twitter feed last week around the idea of deploying innovation and learning teams alongside crisis response teams. And the idea being that the crisis response teams are often too busy manning the pump to actually take to notice the novel practice that might then be able to be carried into beyond the crisis. And so how do you deploy, researchers, anthropologists, organizational psychologists, innovation teams who can spot novelty and can find ways of trying to capture that and play that back to the organization, play that back to themselves when, in a quieter moment. But Marco, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly, because you were asking, what do we need to unlearn? And I think this is a kind of a broad and maybe not completely defined realm, but I think we need to unlearn our ideas about some of the underlying principles of how we govern questions of risk and uncertainty. And I think just to give you two very quick examples from the Finnish context from here in Helsinki, on the one hand, we have an idea that preparedness for things like this, there's a kind of industrial logic and a bit of a 19th century logic. So what we've done for the first time since the war is we've opened up our strategic reserves. So there's big storage spaces because apparently we have lots of masks there. And they were distributed to hospitals, and then the hospitals said that these expired in 2012. And so they're not useful. And they were actually collected during the swine flu, I think 2009, right? So we do have these somewhat linear, somewhat 19th century industrial ways of preparing ourselves. And we're realizing that they are unable to deal with all the variables of time and expiration, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the promise that was outlined before is that we've had a much more, maybe to use an overused term, network way of working, where we're beginning to see the capacity to ramp up industry. I think we'll see a return of certain kinds of industries away from Asia, perhaps towards here, because we're beginning to see those as strategic assets and how you mobilize networks. So that's one way. Rather than having stockpiles of stuff, you have stockpiles of capacities that you can activate very quickly. And then on the other end of the spectrum is how do we what's the basis for decision making? And here in Finland, we have a team of 5 people basically determining the architecture of our current decision. And it's 1 epidemiologist, sorry, that's a mouthful, and 4 mathematicians. And what they're basically doing is they're trying to statistically model things, and that's the basis of decision making. So it's pretty remarkable in a day where we have so much information and capacities to do things that's how we're managing this kind of very fluid context. So it shows the vulnerabilities of our current logics and maybe the reductiveness of our decision making at this current point in time.
Thank you. I maybe one, and I'm sort of just going to try and start feeding in some of the really great comments coming in on the chat. So hopefully I'll do justice to this. But I just wanted to maybe see if we could dig in a little bit more into this sort of resilience question, because certainly in many of the government contexts that I've been both operating in and speaking to over the sort of the last 10, 15 years, efficiency has been the kind of the watchword, and so many of our, of our decision-making process and our budget allocation process You know, in Australia, we've had some form of efficiency dividend for, you know, the last 20 years. We don't talk about a resilience dividend. Is this a phase shift that we need to try and help engender? How do we, I guess, how do we make the case for resilience? Clearly leveraging and using moments like this as a learning opportunity. But then how do we embed that so that we don't then just default back to, you know, cost cutting and under-resourcing? Geoff, you mentioned, you know, pandemic preparedness and simulations and stuff like that. I read an article about, you know, the White House being run through a pandemic, you know, preparedness situation in 2016 with the change of administration. That didn't stop them from dismantling the teams and the preparation. So somewhere there wasn't a sort of champion for resilience that could sort of hold the line when they were looking around for sort of, you know, quick wins and cheap cuts. So what needs to shift here on the resilience question? That's to anyone. Or no one. No?
Hi,
Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Hi, it's Tanya from South Africa, just outside Cape Town. I work at a center, an academic center called Center for Complex Systems in Transition. And resilience is sort of one of the key things we look at. And I just want to call it up on screen here. And essentially, resilience means different things to different people in different contexts. And it all is contextual because, you know, there's a complexity aspect to this. But essentially, I think it's different capacities. One of them is to persist, you know, to keep on as one has before, or to recover if a disaster hits you. So obviously, in this context, there are many, many things we don't want to carry on with. We want things to change. The second capacity of resilience is to be able to adapt. And again, in this context, this means adapting really quickly. And then the third, and this is the really interesting one, and this is kind of what I find exciting, and we spend a lot of time working on this. I work in the futures field, is to innovate and transform. So resilience also means to tap into the ingenuity and ability to change. So essentially, it's building the capacity to deal with change, which has different aspects. So I think that's a nice way of thinking about resilience. So, you know, it's not just building redundancy and not having austerity or whatever. I think it's these different capacities. And I think all three of these capacities are really important right now. I'll put a link to some of this work onto the chat box.
Please do. Thank you. Geoff, Gabriella, Marco, would you want to add to that? Otherwise, I can move us on. I've got another word that I haven't heard yet, which I'm surprised by, and I'll drop that in a second.
I'd rather hear from others myself.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I tell you what, I just want to throw this one in because maybe that might prompt another round of conversations, but then, yes, we'll open it up to other questions. I haven't heard anyone talk about the role of trust. Or maybe it was sort of implied in some of the sort of the introduction, Geoff, but you know, we talked about sort of communication, and we talked about data and transparency and all those kinds of things. I'm just wondering, you know, what's happening with how trust is being tested in this situation, how it's being effectively managed and built and cultivated, and are there any lessons there that we ought to be drawing from that, or sort of people that, or countries that we should be sort of looking to as something that an example that we can learn from? And then, yes, I'll open up to everyone.
Well, maybe just a quick comment, and be good to hear examples which you think are good. And they probably happen at several different layers. So there's government leaders speaking to the public in ways which enhance trust. And I think some have done it really well. very open, very honest, acknowledging the difficulties, but also clearly on top of things. Angela Merkel's speech, I thought a week or so ago, was fantastic in that respect. Others have looked, Bolsonaro's maybe the worst example, completely in denial, and let's not even go to Donald Trump as an example. There's then kind of the trust on data. As I said earlier, I think in the short run, people will accept lots of things being done to their data, but not in the medium term without new guarantees against abuse of data. There's a trust at the very local level. How do hospitals, emergency services, and local authorities maintain trust day to day? So it's probably worth disaggregating the question. I'd be fascinated to hear good examples. The places that seem to be unraveling quickest, like in southern Italy, probably parts of India, is where people are being told they have to self-isolate with no financial support, where the state is essentially sort of leaving them to slip very rapidly into extreme poverty. Now, that is almost guaranteed to destroy trust, I would guess.
Okay. I've turned off people's ability to unmute themselves, so we'll see how this goes. Maybe don't all rush for the sort of microphone at the same time, but let's see if we've got a question from the group. Now scared everyone off. Martin, no, you're just laughing.
No. The trouble is that there's such big questions, aren't they? I think for many of us, I'm sure on this call, you're thinking, bloody hell, where do you start this conversation? I want to go back maybe to the resilience thing, because it seems to me they are obviously closely related. I was interested in Marco's observations about how we approach resilience in a somewhat industrial and linear way, and I think that's probably right. But isn't the real problem here? It's almost impossible to convince a politician to invest in something that doesn't appear to be necessary right now. I know there are some long-term issues around, long-term infrastructure builds and so on. But the idea of actually investing, this notion of redundancy, the notion that when you build a network in the communications world, you build a second network deliberately because you don't need it now, but you're going to need it when the pressure's on. Seems to me the politics of that are almost impossible to navigate, where you're actually asking people with limited resources to somehow make more money available to build things and develop capabilities that don't appear to be necessary at a particular time. But then when the pressure's on, that seems to. So I still haven't got in my head how we get around the problem of getting complex political decision making to grab this notion of investing in stuff that we don't appear to need at a particular time. And the other thing quickly I'd say is I think some of our newfound trust in government is actually being driven largely by fear and uncertainty. And you cling on to whatever you can find as the most reliable and apparently truthful source of information at a time when you're really, frankly, shit scared about what the hell's happening.
That's been interesting in Australia. People have actually sort of gravitated back to the mainstream media, and particularly the sort of the state broadcast of the ABC in numbers that they haven't seen for many years.
Yeah, exactly.
I do have a hand up from Luis in Costa Rica, who wanted to share a little bit about sort of how they've sort of managed the trust question in Costa Rica. So Luis, would you like to go ahead? And for anyone else, I can't see the hand. You can use either the hands up function or ping me a private message in group chat, and I'll try and get a few more in before we run out of time. Luis, are you there? Nope. Okay. You might be on mute, Luis. About to miss your opportunity, I'm afraid. No. Okay. Is there somebody else who would? Oh, he can't. Okay. No. Sorry. It's fine. Is there anyone else who would like to make a observation, question, comment, reflection on their own experience in their countries? Amelia, yes, hi. And you're muted. You need to turn your microphone off. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Oh,
I have.
There we go. Yep.
I have. Okay. Hello, everybody. Hi, Gabriella. Long time no see. I have a question, which has to do with our experience of globalization during these times. It might be the first time that the whole world is empirically experiencing how connected we are globally. in all its dimension. And I wondered if you had thoughts around that. It's a question.
Gabriella? I've got 100 and something faces up here, so I can't find you. Where are you? Are you still there?
It's to anybody, the question, not only Gabriella. I just wanted to say hello to her because I haven't seen her for a couple of years.
Excellent.
Just any thoughts around that? How much of that is an opportunity? How much is that an opportunity for us to understand? I mean, Brexit suddenly looks to everybody's eyes, more people's eyes, I guess.
Sorry, you can unmute yourself now. Sorry.
Some kind of absurdity, yeah.
Gabriella, Louise, yes.
So I think that is one of the most urgent questions, I believe, to be had. One of the things that we worked at the lab at one point in time was about city-to-city relationships, if you will, and we actually put into the new constitution of Mexico City being able to sign its own international treaties, surpassing the national government. Of course, now this is a different scale, so I actually think that the governance question becomes one that is very intense on two scales that we haven't done that much about, which is, as I mentioned, the neighborhood level, the horizontal ties, what government, how government plays a role in that, but also most definitely in terms of the global scale, that even though I think we have institutions that are put into place for exactly these conversations, except for perhaps WHO right now, there seems to be a lack of these linkages being made through the organizations that exists. And this quasi-ontological existential thing of all of us living through the same thing at the same time, I do think it will have, again, if we use this imagination, social, political imagination that is coming out of these burning questions that we have, I think could be very productive, for example, of thinking about externalities. Because in the way that the world was, it was so easy, for example, right now that I'm in Holland, just because I'm here, but, to think, okay, quality of life in Holland or in Canada, but then when you think of the externalities happening in other corners of the world at cost to other populations, that becomes a little bit harder to grasp because it's not in my backyard. What happens when the collective decisions actually hit you in the face and hit you everywhere? What type of conversation should this start? So not necessarily an answer, but definitely I think these are part of the burning questions that we should not let this crises cool down without addressing in several ways.
Thank you, Gabriella. We are nearly out of time. I'm just going to it's always the way, it's when the conversation starts getting really exciting that we have to do this, but I'm going to respect people's time. But I'm going to let you know that this is the first of a series, and next week, and I'll have more details in a second on the timing, we're going deeper into questions of citizen engagement, the social contract, and relationships between the citizen and the state. So if you want to dig further into that, come back and join us next week, and we'll have some more people on the couch to keep that conversation along. I do want to give Luis the last chance just to quickly talk about Costa Rica in 2 minutes or less, Luis. And you can unmute yourself now, I pray. I haven't messed this up. So Luis, are you there?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Brenton. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the issue of trust and what Geoff mentioned about self-isolation without public support. In our case in Costa Rica, I have argued publicly that we should not seriously consider lockdown if we are not able to guarantee that we are able to deliver food to everyone that needs it. We had an experience near from one of our neighbors, El Salvador. They were able to raise money with the idea of giving the money to the poor in form of a transfer so that they would be able to buy food. But they crashed against reality because 90% of the people in need don't have bank accounts, and they didn't know where they were located. The last census was from the 90s. So the result was that hungry people just broke the lockdown and went down out massively to the streets. So we're not there yet. We have been relatively doing a good work of containing the spread of the virus from technical and sanitary perspective. But there are many voices asking for complete lockdown, and we have not yet solved the problem of how to deliver food to everyone that will need it. And now entering directly the issue of trust, there are competing solutions from the government and also the private sector, because even within the private sector, some groups of large corporations don't trust small civil society groups. And like the result is that we're fighting with each other, and we're also dealing with government bureaucracy that wants to like centrally plan all the delivery.
Great, thank you, Luis. We are nearly out of time, so I just want to very briefly just give you a few notes, because we will lose people rapidly. We will be sharing the recording. I'm going to suggest that we will put together a Google Doc which both summarizes, hopefully, possibly even drops in the chat verbatim. I know lots of you have been wanting to pull those links off of the chat and or setting up some notes which you can feel free to add to, augment, give us the case studies and examples of what you're seeing around the world. Also, feel free to continue the conversation with us on Twitter. As I said, we will be back next week. It is on Wednesday the 8th. It is a slightly later time. It's going to be 8 o'clock, I understand, London time, so that we can get a few more people from North America on the call. Even harder for us down under. So sorry to the gang who are joining us from Australia and New Zealand. We're just going to have to get up late, but we can have hot milk and cocoa. So look, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you particularly to Geoff, Gabriella, and Marco, and hopefully we see you all again next week. Ciao.